I'm Alex Giannini, and welcome to StoryFest 2020. Due to the ongoing impacts of the coronavirus pandemic, StoryFest 2020 is going virtual. From September 15th to September 29th, StoryFest will premiere 13 live and pre-recorded author events featuring top authors and creators in genre fiction, comics, young adult fiction, and middle grade fiction. This year, we have over 50 authors joining us from all across the country, and in cross-genre panels, they will explore the big ideas at the heart of telling stories in today's world. Even though we can't welcome you to the library's forum in person, we're glad to have you with us virtually. Thanks for being here. Enjoy StoryFest 2020.
Emma J. Gibbon is originally from the UK and now lives in Maine. Her debut fiction collection, Dark Blood Comes from the Feet, is out now. She also has a story upcoming in Would But Time Await, an anthology of New England folk horror. Her poetry has been published in Strange Horizons, Liminality, and Kaleidotrope, among others. Rachel Harrison was born and raised in the weird state of New Jersey. She received her bachelor's in writing for film and television from Emerson College. After graduating, she worked on TV game shows, in publishing, and for a big bank. She lives in Rochester, New York with her husband and their cat, Overlord. The Return is her first novel. Rob Hart is the author of The Warehouse, which is sold in more than 20 languages and been optioned for film by Ron Howard. He is also the author of the Ash McKenna PI series, the short story collection Takeout, and he co-wrote Scot Free with James Patterson. Benjamin Percy is the author of 4 novels, most recently The Darknet, 3 story collections, including Suicide Woods, and a book of essays titled Thrill Me. His sci-fi trilogy, The Comet Cycle, will be published in 2021. He is part of the new dawn of X-Men at Marvel and writes both Wolverine and X-Force. He has also written for DC Comics and Dynamite Entertainment and is known for his celebrated runs on Green Arrow, Teen Titans, Nightwing, and James Bond. Errick Nunnally was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. He served 1 tour in the Marine Corps before deciding art school would be a safer and more natural pursuit. He is permanently distracted by art, comics, science fiction, history, and horror. Errick's work includes the novels Blood for the Sun, All the Dead Men, and Lightning Wears a Red Cape, a comic strip collection, Lost in Transition, and first prize in one hamburger contest. Dennis E. Staples is an Ojibwe writer from Minnesota. He graduated from the Institute of American Indian Arts with an MFA in fiction. He is a graduate of the 2018 Clarion West Writers Workshop and a recipient of the Octavia E. Butler Memorial Scholarship. His work has appeared in Asimov's Science Fiction and Nightmare magazine. He is an enrolled member of the Red Lake Nation. This Town Sleeps is his debut novel. Our moderator, Bracken Macleod, is the splatterpunk, Bram Stoker, and Shirley Jackson Award-nominated author of the novels Mountain Home, Come to Dust, Stranded, and Closing Costs. He's also published 2 collections of short fiction, 13 Views of the Suicide Woods, no relation to Benjamin Percy's wonderful collection, and White Knight and Other Pawns.
All right, everyone. Hey, welcome to What the Dark Teaches Us, and our illustrious panel who've already been introduced to you. So we can jump right into to the questions and to the discussion. And I hope you have as good a time as I am convinced we're about to. So, I wanted to just come right out of the gate, guns a-blazing, and suggest that since we're living in the worst possible timeline right now, I wanted to open with why dark fiction at all? What is it that we're hoping to achieve with our work in a world that's already filled with so much discord and trial? Like, what is it about it that draws you to it? Anyone want to jump in first?
Yeah, I think we've seen, historically, we've seen, this might be the worst possible time for us at this moment, but, throughout history, there have been worse times for fiction. And why dark fiction? I think we're all generally obsessed with a certain amount of loss. Like everybody's very concerned about that. And from a fiction standpoint, I think in a lot of ways it lets people experience that very briefly and outside of their body, and it can be an escape, more of a release and an escape than as much for the author as it is for the reader. And we can't let that go. There's always this. Everybody's kind of worried about the dark things that can happen. So I think anybody who writes fiction, it serves as an inspiration all the time.
I think it's certainly understandable that right now maybe the only thing you want to do is watch Finding Nemo on repeat over and over, while cozied up in a Snuggie. But there's something to be said about how throughout history, oftentimes some of the great works of dark fiction and speculative fiction are very much born out of the moment and born out of cultural unease. If you look at everything from Frankenstein coming out of the Industrial Revolution and the fear of man playing God, the fear of science and technology, to the Red Scare and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, to Godzilla and post-atomic anxieties. And you could just go through every era of human history and kind of track these great works that came out of these moments, that took a knife to the nerve of these moments. And, I think that there's something to be said about the catharsis that can come when you channel these upset feelings onto the page, and when readers too find catharsis in experiencing these worlds that are oftentimes maybe cracked mirror versions of what we're experiencing right now.
It's funny that you mentioned catharsis, because this is the word that I think comes up the most when we talk about sort of dark fiction as a value, as sort of a value, is something that brings value to society. But I wonder, does it give us a sense of relief? At the end of a dark story, do we feel really relieved of a burden, or do we simply feel kind of differently burdened for a while? Is it a kind of doom shifting?
Well, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately because, like half the stuff I wrote about in The Warehouse came true. Like The Warehouse was about a world where like you're forced indoors, you rely on indoor shopping, kids are learning by video, all this, like it's actually kind of creepy. And but it made me really sort of like think about that, where it's like I don't think any of us get into this because we think the world is going to end. Like I don't think spec fiction writers or science fiction writers, or really any writers in general, we don't do this because we think there's an opportunity to like, dance on the grave before the world is over. We do it because we see something on the horizon and we kind of want to talk about it and sound a little bit of an alarm bell. And I think ultimately a lot of these stories ends like, even if it's on a bit of a down note, it's at least a bit of a hopeful note. And I think we're all kind of hopeful that people can see these things and recognize them and want to start thinking or acting differently. So I mean, I do think there is some catharsis involved, in the sense that it's really about taking these things, kind of blowing them out of proportion so we can see them a little bit better, and then hopefully like taking a lesson from them.
So you see it as a kind of a contextualization almost.
Yeah, essentially, because like I always go back to Tom Spanbauer, who said that fiction is the lie that tells the truth truer, which I think is like one of the best things I've ever heard, and I think it's absolutely true. I think that like, especially now when you read the news, it just seems so ridiculous and it's so over the top, and so sometimes you kind of need a story to feel a little bit grounded.
Right. Emma, Rachel, Dennis, do you guys have any one of you or all of you have a feeling about the idea of catharsis, contextualization, and confronting the darkness?
I think that there's a way that people handle things, and you do get a kind of split. Like for me, as far as writing fiction goes, it turns dark. I don't have that much control over it. It's just where it comes from. So for me, there is a darkness there. But I notice in my other job as a librarian is that during this pandemic, the difference between people who are reading fluffy, light things to escape, and then you know, The Stand has been out continuously. We had to buy extra copies, you know. So there's people who go for the light, fluffy thing, and there's the people who are rereading The Stand. I'm reading Survivor Song, so we can all see where I am in that. So I do think it's a coping mechanism. It's a, okay, I can prepare by reading this. It's scenarios to practice. So not just catharsis, but kind of training. You know, if you can imagine the worst that can happen, maybe you can survive it when it does. I think that's part of it too.
Yeah, to add to that, I think dark fiction is a safe space to explore our worst fears, because the stakes aren't real. I mean, when you're reading, you might feel the emotions as if they're real, but I think that's why we do it, because it's almost like a test. So it might be cathartic, or it might just be. You might just experience these emotions and then just walk away from it not feeling like okay. You might walk away from it feeling not okay, but now you know. It's, you know, it's pressing on a bruise, I think, and sometimes you just have to see how it feels.
Right. I love that you mentioned safe space, and we're gonna kind of get into a little bit of responsibility in a minute. But yeah, I love this idea that it's an examination of horror without having to be immersed in it in a way that we are so much kind of immersed in it at the moment. Dennis, do you have any thoughts on this, or?
Sure. I guess I tend to seek out fiction that can just get a really visceral reaction from me, both inwardly and kind of outwardly, in that I'll kind of dwell on it for a while, and most of my family will know if I'm reading something I'm really into, or if the ending I didn't like it. I really enjoyed the fiction stories where the upset ending, the darkness, it stays with you, and you argue with yourself. You want to tell the writer they're wrong, because it gives you that it gives you a sense of darkness, even as just a recreational activity. So I always try and read fiction that will stay with me, even if it's not what I wanted at all by the end. And just that contrast between starting fiction, or starting reading something that is it draws you in a bit, and you want it to go well, but you also don't, because you want it to get as dark as possible, and you want that catharsis is definitely part of it too, because at the end of it, you're all kind of at a loss for words right now, but it just
Sure. It sounds to me like a part of what you're looking for in your own leisure reading is some boundary pushing, is to have a feeling evoked in you by the material, and not just sort of a very familiar, comfortable story of darkness. Is that?
Yes.
Fair?
Yeah, very fair. I like the story to kind of take you to a place you never thought you wanted to go, and by the end of it, you still don't really want to, but it's great having been there.
So I guess, springboarding off the idea of provocation, is there a responsibility to dark fiction, whether and so far we've been talking, I think, in a very generalized way, and pandemic fiction has come into it. We'll get into that a little bit deeper in a minute. But I mean, between horror, Rob, I know crime. You had your crime trilogy through Polis Books. Ben, you've written in that genre as well. Depending, I suppose, irrespective of whether it's horror, thriller, crime. I mean, is there a responsibility to dark fiction itself, or in its creators, to at least examine the state of dark fiction in a way that is provocative, but also is sensitive to sort of the material itself? I guess the question I want to ask is there an ethics of being a dark fiction writer, and what is that responsibility we have as creators to readers?
I think what Rachel, Emma, and Dennis touched on, what it made me think of was dark fiction stories that are written in the historical context. So they're built around something that actually happened. And I do think there's some responsibility there to get those details right, because I think it's clearly the writer's trying to communicate something about that history. And I think we see that in like Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, or Octavia Butler's novel about traveling back to slavery. I don't know what,
No, that one
title.
Kindred.
novels ever. So
Kindred, okay. And, you know, and we're seeing it in a number of properties on television, Watchmen, and Lovecraft Country most recently, where they're built around things that have actually happened. And I think there's definitely a responsibility there to get enough of those details right that if people are deeply affected by those stories, that they will look into the historical context for them. And so I think in that respect, you have to have a certain amount of ethics and personal responsibility to get that right.
Actually, I think Watchmen is a really good example, because I just recently rewatched that, and like there's that scene in like the 5th episode where it's like a POV shot of like someone being lynched, and it's like, that is brutal to watch. Like, that's hard, but it's also like it's necessary for the story because it was the reality back then, and to deny that, especially at a time like this when you know the world is basically on fire, is almost irresponsible. You know, we have to confront those things, but at the same time, I do really strongly believe that being transgressive just to be transgressive, just for the fun of it, is irresponsible. You know, to make things like, if you're going into a story thinking like I'm gonna push boundaries and I'm gonna cross the line and I'm gonna offend people and I'm gonna be that guy, like that's not fun. That's not interesting. Like you're not treating it responsibly. You're not treating it artistically. Like if you want to push those boundaries and cross those lines, it has to be for a reason. And I think that, again, Watchmen was a good example of that, when it was like, we're going to show you a reality, you know, even by opening with the Tulsa Massacre, which was something that really, you know, most people didn't know about. You know, you can credit that show for raising the awareness about that historical event. And again, like something that was really brutal to watch, but you know, we also can't pretend that it didn't happen.
Yeah, when I used to be a teacher, I remember encountering a lot of, especially freshman male stories, what I called gornography, which was, you know, titillation for the sake of titillation, or transgression for the sake of transgression. And I was trying to come up with a way to, you know, sort of teach these students about how to have a kind of consciousness, you know, or conscience rather, to inform the way that you perpetuated violence on the page, you know, giving examples like Eula Biss's Time and Distance Overcome, which is an essay all about racial violence in America, which forces you to look, as does Watchmen, at these very uncomfortable events, but with purpose. You know, you are meant to be horrified. And you're seeing a lot of that right now. You're seeing it in Watchmen, as mentioned. You're seeing it in Lovecraft Country, or what Peele did before that with Us and Get Out. And it certainly, you know, I feel like I've got something on my shoulder as well right now. It's just whispering in my ear and trying to find, you know, some larger purpose in the work I'm putting on the page that I'm hammering down. And, you know, if you look at, like, this is not necessarily dark fiction, but working up, you know, at Marvel, working with the X-Men right now, sort of interesting what's happening where, you know, for the longest time, the mutants are, you know, subjects of oppression. It's a story about xenophobia. And right now, it's no coincidence that here you have the Me Too movement, here you have Black Lives Matter, here you have, you know, those who have been subjugated for too long standing up and saying enough is enough. And at the same time, like, we're trying to write this story about the mutants where they have, you know, stood up and said enough is enough and sort of claimed sovereignty, and taken extreme measures to own their role in the world, because they've looked into the future and see that they are decimated by the human population 100 years from now. So, you know, working with properties like that, or, you know, I just wrote a screenplay about the Bonus Army. If you don't know about this section of US history, when everybody came back from World War I, they were promised $1,000 and given a certificate, but that bonus was not paid out in the years to come. And here we are at the height of the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover's in office. These people desperately need the money. They march on Washington. They form Hoovervilles all around the White House and the Capitol building, and Hoover sends out the military to take them all down. And so you have this massive public demonstration and veterans go against veterans, and the entire Capitol burns, right? So writing about something like that right now, it's some way for me to, unload some of what's in my heart and hopefully to provoke similar feelings in my readership.
I think what we have and ultimately have a responsibility is to write a good story. And I think you're all touching upon this, like to write a good story, you have to think about what's happening in the world and what's happened historically. It's about getting your details right. It's making sure that historically things are correct. And it's about not having a gore fest or just shocking people for the sake of shocking people, because that's not a good story either. So I think all of these things come under this umbrella of, am I telling a good story? Am I serving the story I want to tell? And if you can do that, then all of these things come into play too.
No, I think that, I think that's all really wonderful. It's funny because we do talk about what did you call it, Benjamin? The gore. Pornography, yeah, and I think as a culture, we've touched on the idea of this when we were having a conversation a few years ago about torture porn. Right. Which I actually like pornography a little bit better, but either way, the idea that violence or something for its own sake is a form of storytelling that people engage in, and some people certainly seek out. And what's our role in this? Because there is a market for extreme horror. Right. I don't have a taste for it, but there are a lot of people who do, and enough that they can attend conventions dedicated to it. I think I want to move on and I think we touched on this with Watchman and Lovecraft Country. I'm interested in a conversation about diversity in dark fiction, which is to say, not necessarily representation, although I think it's incredibly important, but how your background as a creator or your background as an individual has influenced your work as a creator, which is to say, Errick and I on several occasions have had conversations about the fact that some things that I would see like in the news, right, are very clearly for a large portion of this nation horror stories, where there's a big group of the demographic, mainly guys like me, white guys who haven't had to deal with the same problems of racial disparity or violence against women or anything like this. I think about them as horrible news stories, right? And my first inclination isn't to be so affected by them and terrified by them, but more or less saddened. And I'm wondering, we've got a fairly diverse panel. What you have brought as an individual to what scares you and how you try to channel that.
Hey, go ahead. I don't know
Okay.
who's talking.
The news story, I talked about the news story and what others can see as a horror, reminded me. One of the early influences that in my writing career, I think I was not career, just writing life. When I was in 6th grade, around the time that some of my teachers noticed that I like to read and write a lot, and one of them invited me to a conference for young aspiring authors. But around this time, there was a news article in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune that was written about my home reservation. It was titled "The Lost Youth of Leech Lake." It's a 20,000-word article that chronicled a few different tragedies that had happened. Some of them very graphic, disturbing, and very, very close to home. One of my classmates was the younger brother of one of these Native people chronicled in there. I believe their older sibling had overdosed, and there was a community outcry. People were not happy that just these details were kind of put just right out there on the line. The first time I heard of it, there were people going around the school looking for maybe some donations to try and write a bit of a rebuttal. And I know that Leech Lake had at least one meeting about it because this writer was from the area, but they were non-native. So that was a kind of pivotal moment for me to really think about the idea of portraying our background and how to do it tastefully, and how not to feel like you're being indulgent. That was another big criticism here, is that this person wasn't, their intentions may have been to raise awareness, but a lot of people felt it was just kind of an exercise in exploitation and, grief indulgence.
So I can understand that, because so I'm from a very working class British background. I come from an ex-mining town. One of my earliest memories is the miners' strike. So the entire town lost their jobs, and I remember the soup kitchens and things like that. And that is a large part of who I am, because after that, the towns where the mines closed, they just died. They were flooded with heroin. A lot of streets were knocked down because they couldn't be saved. And that's where I come from, and it's an area that has a lot of problems, and we had outsiders come in to tell our stories, but it was mainly about, look at all these stupid poor people, basically, and I got lucky by the fact that I was one of the last people who got university tuition paid for me, so I was able to move out. But part of that is very core of what I am and what my stories tell. Like my stories, I want to put in the center of them the people that don't normally get to be in the center of stories. So basically, not your average white guy. So I consciously tell stories about working class women, about women with no children, about people who are not straight, people who are not white. And I'm not perfect, and I'm trying to do more of that, but it's very important to me that other people get to be in the stories now, that our stories get to be told too, and so it's incredibly, my background is incredibly important to what I write. Yeah.
I agree wholeheartedly with that, Emma. I wrote down a few things that I immediately thought of from my background, but how it also occurred to me how similar they can be to different groups of people. So I grew up in Boston, but I grew up in a neighborhood that's essentially an island in Boston, and that's a kind of isolation from society, because the pace of the world around that neighborhood was very different. The experiences, the whole nine, were very different from the way we experienced it, and it remains that way to this day, which is almost science fictional. There's being pursued, by authority, holding a place in society that means your pursuit is of a decidedly different flavor than anybody else's, as well as the being forced within a society to make abnormal decisions. And I was thinking of anything from the incident that happened recently with Jacob Blake, a man who was just shot several times in the back after breaking up a fight, a domestic disturbance. He went to his car where his kids were, and he was shot several times in the back. Like these are decisions we don't ever think we're going to be forced to make. This was after he'd been tased, and he was clearly probably worried about his kids who'd been left in the car, as well as colonial situations like what Belgium did in the Congo. I can't imagine needing to make the kinds of decisions that families had to make under that kind of oppression, that kind of brutality. Columbus in the Caribbean, same type of thing. So I think those experiences certainly drive a certain amount of my fiction, as well as putting people into the fiction that I did not normally see when I was growing up, and folks that I think should also have a shot at these things that are going to bring these different experiences to the story itself and drive things in a very different way.
You know, we talked a little bit about responsibility before, and I think more than ever right now, there's a responsibility for writers to sort of be more cognizant of these issues. You know, I mean, I'm from my parents are working class, but I've still been, you know, I went to a private school. You know, we didn't have a ton of money growing up, but we did okay. I have been the recipient of a massive amount of privilege, even though it doesn't always feel that way. But I never had to live a life where it was like, you know, I'm going to get pulled over by a cop and is this guy going to shoot me because my hand twitches? Like that's not a reality I've ever really had to contend with. And so I think given the current climate, I think it's really incumbent on writers, but especially for white male writers, to really think a lot about the way like our responsibilities and our privileges, and really sometimes how our privileges can blind us, and how we can kind of like miss those things and not see those things.
That's fantastic. So, you know, speaking of reality, and I think we've addressed, you know, the idea of individual reality. So I'd like to sort of broaden it and talk about our collective reality, which is that earlier, Emma, I think you mentioned The Stand, and you know, pandemic fiction has been around as long as there's been fiction and pandemics, right? I mean, from Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year and Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, you know, we've got The Plague and The Stand, and now Survivor Song from Paul Tremblay. I guess my question is, do you find it a sort of form of self-care to read stories in the middle of a pandemic where people are able to emerge at the end, because published novels have a beginning, middle, and end, usually, right? Typically. But we haven't reached the end of this yet. So do you feel like having that optimism at the end is a necessary part of our experience right now, or should we be taking a break? Anyone is welcome to jump in.
Let me speak of this sort of from a sideways angle, in that I recently hosted a viewing of both They Live and Videodrome, and found them both to be wildly prescient when it came to this era of social media that we live in, and the spread of disinformation, and the way that we are infected by the signals that are ghosting through the air. And I actually found it reassuring that these films made back in the 80s, you know, Videodrome, just as the 80s began, you know, here it is talking about the rise of network TV, but still resonates right now. And here we are looking at Survivor Song, but Survivor Song will not be the last pandemic novel, and this will not be the last pandemic. We're going to continue to cycle through moments like this, you know, whether it's 10 years from now or a century from now. And, you know, there's something about looking to the 1980s and finding that these movies, corny and raw as they might be, are actually speaking to the present, because it just makes you feel a little bit less alone and a little bit more aware that this is a conversation that's been going on for a long time.
Right. Yeah, you know, it's funny. I love that you mentioned cinema, because I don't think we can talk about literature without recognizing cinema as a form of storytelling, as a legitimate, nuanced form of storytelling. And those films from the 80s are great. You know, I think a lot of them were made with the eye toward using disease or some sort of extinction event as a metaphor for the threat of nuclear war or something, but, you know, viewing them through a modern lens and not so metaphorical anymore. You can watch Night of the Comet and just kind of have an experience with, oh shit, what if there aren't any more people? But Does anyone else have a feeling about pandemic fiction in the middle of a pandemic? Do you have a favorite pandemic book that really resounds to you, either when you first read it or especially now?
I have one. It's the only one I've read so far. I have avoided the pandemic novels, specifically The Stand, but mostly because it's just very long. And I've wanted to check out Survivor Song, but recently I was both listening to and rereading Tracks by Louise Erdrich. And as it begins, they're in the middle of a tuberculosis pandemic in the early 1900s. And it's about a family, the Pillagers, who most of them are killed off, and this main character Nanapush takes in the last daughter of the Pillagers and what happens to their land afterward. And so it mixes both the tuberculosis that is going around and kind of ravaging the reservation, and mixes it with this tribal this kind of law story about the tribes losing their land to allotment and the carving up of their reservation. It's not exactly a happy novel for the end, for the catharsis, because at the end, when the politics are there, that makes it all the more depressing, because nowadays there are a lot of reservations that still don't have a lot of land ownership within their borders, but it does in a way have a bit of optimism, because it gives the message of survival through just sticking together as a community and holding true to our values while also navigating in an ever-changing world.
Whenever
Go ahead, Errick.
whenever this topic comes up, like the first thing I think of is the film The World, the Flesh, and the Devil.
Oh, I love that film.
It's a great film. It was released in 1959. It was based on a novel and a short story from just the very beginning of the 20th century. And what I enjoyed about it, and since you mentioned Night of the Comet, is that it takes this very big event, in the World of Flesh and the Devil, it's a radioactive cloud that someone weaponized and whoops, killed everybody. And the entire film revolves around three people. So this really big notion of mass death that doesn't result in feral zombies running around or anything like that, but that you get this very human story with three people, is what makes it so much more interesting. The fact that Harry Belafonte would lead the movie was kind of a big deal for me, at least when I was watching it, because so here's this black man, and initially he meets a white woman, and there's lots of subtle issues in terms of racism and misogyny that are explored, and then so the whole thing sort of kicks up a notch when another man shows up, but it's a white guy. So you've got these three people who have to sort through these base aspects of society, especially at the time, like 1959. I can't believe they did this, but it was an excellent film. But I think these pandemic or disaster post-apocalyptic films that deal with a very small cast are the most interesting to me, because that's dealing with isolation and the vestiges of society that they're dragging forward with them.
I was a big fan of Wanderers by Chuck Wendig.
Yeah, I haven't read that yet.
It's really, really good. It's funny. It came out around the same time as Warehouse, so we spent a lot of time like on the convention circuit, and we did a bunch of events together because there were some similarities between the two books. And then as the quarantine started to hit, it's like we each got the COVID thing half right. And so we ended up like hopping on YouTube and doing like talking about it a little bit. And I think the first 10 minutes is just being like, God, this is depressing. But it's interesting because there's some stuff that you dig down there where like, there's some artificial intelligence involved, and apparently like there's some artificial intelligence involved in the prediction of COVID. It's very strange, but it's like an 800-page book. I think I read it in like 2 days. It just tears.
Nice. Yeah, no, that's a big one. That's the only reason I haven't read it yet, is just because I have to I have to block off. Man, do I have to block off some time to read a book that's that long, especially in the
Oh
middle of
yeah.
this. Middle of
No,
this
it's a doorstop. It's huge. You could like they sent one to me, and like my mail carrier was mad at me. It's like, what are you doing? But yeah, no, I mean, I tore through it. But I also really like Wendig's writing, so highly recommended.
Station 11 too.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I was just about to say. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
That one I picked up at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think I like to read pandemic fiction where things are a little bit worse than they are in this timeline. Like I watched Train to Busan, which is great. That's a zombie movie. But I was still like, we're not there. Trying to like find some silver lining. I think that's kind of the comfort that I find in it right now. Reading Survivor Song, there are a few passages where I'm just like, this is like it's still brilliant and different enough that it wasn't just like watching the news. But I definitely, Train to Busan is fun and way more scary than our current world, if you can believe it. And Station 11 is a very beautiful book.
Yeah, no, Station 11 was wonderful. The one that I thought of when you mentioned that was Eden. I don't know how to say her last name. I think it's Lepecki. Eden Lepecki's California, which is another sort of post-apocalyptic novel, but it's very, very personal. It's very focused on individuals and a couple's experience in isolation. So let's sort of move off topic a little bit, or I guess in a different direction, and talk about sort of your origins in dark fiction. What was your introduction to dark fiction? How old were you? What was it? You want to start, Rachel?
Sure. I think my earliest memory with dark fiction was probably Stephen King's It. I saw a copy at a garage sale, and I remember asking my mom about it because I was too young to read it. And she basically told me the concept, and I was scared anyway. And I think I had a kind of like very touch and go relationship with dark fiction, and I write horror, so specifically horror where I'm terrified of everything. So I'm really affected by it. So I kind of, when I was growing up, I would sort of avoid it or watch it like this. But as I got older, I sort of started to lean into it and realize that, oh no, you actually love this. Even though it scares you, it's because you're obsessed with it. So I would say probably It is my origin story. And then throughout there are many other influences. But if I had to like dig through my early childhood nightmares, that's up there.
That's up there. Anyone else want to comment on how they got interested in this? What was it that made you sort of an aficionado?
I think I always, there's different things, but I always had a bit of it. Like I remember when, I'm aging myself here, but when video stores first, appeared, we would go and me and my brother would go and look at the covers, and the horror ones were always the best ones. And we couldn't convince anybody to get them out for us, but we'd go and look at like the Lost Boys cover and the Phantasm cover and imagine what the movies were about before we could watch them. But I think as far as literature goes, I used to go to yard sales too, and I'd pick the covers that I liked, and the paperbacks with the yellow edges were always my favorite. And I would pick stuff like the Hitchcock's stories and things like that, and any Stephen King. And most of the time, I was just like this little kid with big glasses, so the people would just give me the books. They wouldn't sell me them. They'd be just like, oh yeah, here. I guess they were, I think, stuff like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I'd walk home with that, and I was tiny. But the other thing, I went to my first Scholastic book fair, and I bought it was a collection of short horror stories, and there was stuff like Dickens and Saki's Laura was in it, and I think that was the one where she basically she dies and she keeps being reincarnated as things to like agitate her husband, you know. So she basically spends this story being reincarnated and tormented her husband. And I think it was that where I was like, this is my kind of thing. This is what I want to do. So yeah, it was way back.
I think
For me,
my
it's
first
mostly
experience.
comic books. Sorry, go ahead, Nick. Well, I've got right here just an example. This is actually the first comic book I ever bought.
Whoa.
I used to go to this mercantile. I lived in such a rural area. We didn't have a grocery store. We had a mercantile, you know, the wide plank flooring and the butcher in the back, like the smell of blood, you know, soaked through the whole store, and there lacquered fish on the wall and everything. And my mom would take me in. She'd plunk me down at the spinner rack. Remember spinner racks? I remember spinner racks. And I would have to sit there and read the comics. And if I was good during the course of her shopping expedition, I could take one home. So I was never there for, you know, the gum by the register or the candy bars by the register. What I was after was, you know, this. It's been read so many times, it's fallen apart long ago. And, you know, Man Thing, the tagline of which is, "Whatever knows fear burns at the touch of the Man Thing." And it wasn't just Man Thing, and it wasn't just Moon Knight. It was also the Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror comics, which again I just happen to have, that were reissued by EC Comics, and I would read over and over and over again. And just these are out because I just gave them to my son, trying to infect him with the same sort of poison. So, and I don't know what the first horror novel. I'm not even positive what the first novel is that I read, but I know that Stephen King, obviously, you know, the King, you know, owned me for many years, and I read, I think, for 2 years almost exclusively Stephen King, along with Anne Rice and Dean Koontz and Peter Straub and Robert R. McMahon. But the gateway for me was really comic books.
My first experience with dark fiction was through science fiction, and as much as I enjoyed the movies and television that involved, you know, aliens and lasers and all that sort of just fun stuff, this was the first book that I picked up and read on my own. It's Day of the Beast by John Muller, and there's hardly any information in here. There's just a copyright line. There's almost nothing else in this book. And you know, it was published in 1966. And it's about an invasion of monsters that are sent by aliens, but not just aliens from the future. And one guy has to, you know, they managed to fling one guy forward in time to find and sabotage this whole plot. And I read it in like a day. I just sat down and burned through it, but it was so dark, right? Everything is going wrong. This one guy is completely isolated, and it seems utterly hopeless the entire way through the book. And I was like, this is really dark. Like I never would have expected to, you know, as much as I love comics, I read, you know, I love the spinner racks, and I read a lot of those comics too. But it never seemed as hopeless as this particular novel in the first place. And I was like, wow, that seems a little more authentic, like a little more true to actual human experience. That, you know, hopelessness is a part of our existence, and you know, it means more, I think, if you experience that and overcome it.
Dennis, did you want to jump in?
I'd say my first introduction was when I was 13. My sister's then boyfriend had lent me a copy of his The Thief of Always by Clive Barker, and when I opened the flap to see author's bio, said that listed him as a gay author. I'm like, oh yeah, I'll totally read this. And it's a cute story. It's a more of a young adult one, but it's still enough dark themes in there that I definitely wanted more. And then once I was done with that, handed it back to him, and he said, well, here's this one. And it was The Hellbound Heart, which later became Hellraiser, and then he also had a copy of the first 3 volumes of the Books of Blood. And so that summer, I read all those 3 things right in a row and just absolutely loved it. Loved how disturbing Clive could get, how humorous there's a lot of humor there, and since then I've been a very big Clive Barker fan.
Rachel or Rob, do you guys have a memory of a formative book that really spoke to you as a young person?
I have a sort of visceral memory of reading Intensity by Dean Koontz. I was on like a big Dean Koontz kick, and my mom encouraged me with that. Like, she would give me his books, and I was in like 7th or 8th grade, and even then I knew I went to her at one point. I'm like, Ma, like, why are you letting me read these books? I am not old enough to be reading these books. And she's like, no, it's probably fine. But I just remember reading that and being like, definitely not old enough to like understand half of what was going on, but really sort of I still remember a lot of that book, like this far removed from it, to the point that even just talking about it now makes me kind of want to revisit it just out of curiosity.
That's when I hear a lot of people comment on, Dean Koontz gets a lot of grief in the horror community for being sort of a lesser than author, but that's the one that everyone seems to latch onto, like his really sort of profound achievement.
Yeah, it was like the most grounded, because I remember like some of them that there were like time travel books and werewolf books and angel and demon books, and they were all like kind of weird. And I guess like that was the one that kind of stood out to me as like, this is the most realistic, and therefore, that much scarier, because it's about like a lunatic that you could just come across at any point, not like, some sort of supernatural being that doesn't actually exist.
Rachel?
Well, and then thinking about it.
First.
No, that's all right.
Everyone's stuff that I forgot the order.
No, it's okay. But thinking about it too, like, I remember going to the library in elementary school and like reading a book about Baba Yaga with the illustrations, and reading like the Grimm fairy tales. And like, I kind of went in being like, princesses. And then those are really, really, really dark, and kind of being into it. So I would say, like, even as before it and as a young child, just like being in like the elementary school library, there's still stuff to discover that I sort of gravitated to.
Yeah, so I guess a question for the librarians on the panel is there something that you see that's moving younger readers today that's standing out as the gateway book for kids now?
I mean, I just briefly, Rachel reminded me then, I just remembered, and I totally forgot about this, just how obsessed I was with Bluebeard as a kid, which is really weird now I think about it, but I really, really liked Bluebeard. Anyway, I mainly deal with adults as a librarian in my job, so I don't really see what the kids are reading so much, because it's not my department, but I do know that they still run in to go and look at the cover of, is it Afraid of the Dark, that one? Are you Afraid of the Dark? The one, yeah. They still run in to go and look at the cover. Like, it's falling to pieces, it's an old book, but still, I notice kids running in to go and look at that book after all this time.
There you go. So we're almost out of time. Surprisingly, we're almost out of time. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. So I want to end with this question, which is, because the world of late has been such a dark place, what is it that you're enjoying right now that's bringing some light into it? And it can be dark fiction. It doesn't have to be uplifting fiction, but something that's really moving you in a way that's kind of holding you together during stay at home and COVID and a political election.
You know what I've been binging lately is Psych. It was on like USA or TNT or something, and now like it's all on Amazon Prime, and it is like it is so fun and so goofy. It's like it's a Sherlock style like case of the week show with like, you know, the goofy psychic detective and the slightly straight man, you know, partner, although he's almost as much of a goofball as Sean, the main character. And it's like it's the perfect thing to watch right now. It's just fun and goofy and light and clever, and like that's all I want at this moment.
I'm watching Alone, which, you know, all reality TV is garbage, but this is prestige garbage. It's the greatest reality TV show ever made. And season 6 right now is on Netflix. And it's like The Real Survivor, where they dump people in the wilderness, but they're not together. They're truly on their own patch of land in the Arctic Circle, alone, and they get 10 items to bring with them. There's no camera crew. It's all GoPros. And, you know, first episode, somebody breaks their leg. Next episode, somebody eats a muskrat and gets infected with parasites. It's great. And feels just like it's speaking to me in this moment, speaking to us all alone.
I've been watching Jane the Virgin, and to me, it's a very charming show whenever it shows how insecure but determined she is about her writing. And I absolutely love some of the jokes they come up with when she's in the zone, and you see the Courier font in the background, and just a lot of really fun meta writing jokes. That's what I've been doing.
I've been watching The Umbrella Academy, which is super fun. Highly recommend. And the Radio Rental podcast is also super fun. And, you know, Umbrella Academy has some kind of like superhero bend kind of, and then Radio Rental's like a bit dark and kind of like local legend kind of thing. But most of the fiction I read is all dark fiction. So that it's fun, but if you're looking for something to like take you out of the darkness, I don't know if that's what we're recommending here.
I mean, that's what it takes, right? That's what it takes.
Yeah.
I think I've fallen back on all the things that I just have always enjoyed. And you know, it's just about anything that has to do with superheroes, anything that has to do with monsters, and kung fu flicks, martial arts movies. So anything within that group, like The Monster on Netflix. I just watched Sweetheart, Enter the Badlands, The Umbrella Academy. I'm gonna watch Code. I think it's called Code 8 soon. It's the movie they spun out of a short film that's about superpowers and people coping with them. Stuff like that, yeah.
I'm always late to things. I always say I'm going to watch something and then it'll be years later. So I've just finished the first season of Penny Dreadful. And this, and people are telling me, they're like, it's your thing, Emma, you're going to like it. And just that, you know, recognizing characters and the meta aspect for it is really satisfying to my brain. And the portrayal of Dr. Frankenstein is the only one I've ever found sympathetic, which is quite a feat because I normally hate him. The other thing I've been watching, and this, I've never been a cool person though, so that's fine. You know, there's music reaction videos on YouTube. There's two brothers, and it's just great. Like, I'm just like crying watching them react to songs. I've been doing that a lot. So yeah, that's what's getting me through, watching people react to songs from my youth for the first time.
That's excellent. Yeah, I try not to answer my own questions, but I want to make one recommendation, which is I've been binging a show. It's short. It's 3 seasons. It's a sitcom called Norseman, and it's from I think Norway. They filmed it twice, so there's a Norwegian language version, but the version that's on Netflix is English language, and it's basically if you took Vikings, the series, but you set it in the office. So it's medieval Vikings, but they're discussing all of their, their livelihoods like the, Steve Carell in The Office would do. You know, like, I don't know about pillaging. Is this a thing we should be doing now? Right. And it's absolutely fantastic. We are going to wrap it up. This has been an absolutely wonderful time. What a great conversation. Thank you to you all for talking to me and talking to each other and being present for this. And And thank you to everyone who's watching this right now. I hope you had a good time.
Thanks for all the questions, Bracken.
Well, my
Thanks for
pleasure.
having us. Yeah.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this panel, head over to our StoryFest 2020 playlist and check out the rest of our virtual author events. And for more information about StoryFest, visit the library's website at www.westportlibrary.org.